Sarah Miller never expected her life to change so dramatically when she walked into the animal shelter that rainy Tuesday morning. She had been thinking about getting a small companion dog, maybe a golden retriever or a beagle, something manageable for her modest two-bedroom house in suburban Portland. What she found instead was a massive English Mastiff sitting quietly in the corner of the largest kennel. Looking absolutely heartbroken, the shelter worker, Janet, noticed Sarah staring at the enormous dog. "That's Bruno," she said with a sad smile. "He's been here for 3 months now. Nobody wants him because of his size." Sarah looked at the gentle giant who had to weigh at least 150 pounds. His coat was a beautiful fawn color with a black mask around his face, and his eyes held a depth of sadness that made her heart ache. "What happened to him?" Sarah asked, moving closer to the kennel. Bruno lifted his massive head and looked at her with hope flickering in his dark eyes. Janet sighed. His previous family had to give him up when they moved to an apartment that didn't allow large dogs. Bruno was raised from a puppy with them. He's completely house-trained, knows basic commands, and has never shown any aggression. He's actually one of the gentlest dogs we've ever had here, but people see his size and get scared. Sarah knelt down near the kennel door. Bruno slowly stood up, and even on all fours, he was almost as tall as she was while kneeling. But instead of being intimidating, something about him seemed vulnerable and sweet. He pressed his massive head against the kennel door, trying to get closer to her. "Can I meet him properly?" Sarah asked. Janet looked surprised but pleased. "Of course. Let me get him on a leash." When they brought Bruno out to the meeting room, Sarah was amazed at how gently he moved, despite his enormous size. He walked slowly and carefully, as if he was aware that he needed to be cautious around smaller beings. The moment they were in the room together, Bruno did something unexpected. He walked over to Sarah and very carefully placed his giant head in her lap, looking up at her with those soulful eyes. The gesture was so gentle and trusting that Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. "He really likes you," Janet whispered. "He doesn't do that with everyone." Sarah ran her hands through Bruno's soft fur, marveling at how such a massive dog could be so gentle. "Tell me more about his personality," she said. "Well," Janet began, pulling out Bruno's file. "According to his previous family, Bruno has always thought he was a lapdog. Despite weighing 150 pounds, he would try to curl up on the couch with them, squeeze into spaces that were clearly too small for him, and follow them around the house like a shadow. He's incredibly affectionate, but in the most gentle way possible." As if to demonstrate this, Bruno carefully maneuvered himself so that he could rest more of his body against Sarah while still being gentle. She could feel his contentment as he relaxed against her. "The family said he was particularly good with children," Janet continued. "He seemed to understand that he needed to be extra careful around little ones. There was a toddler in the house, and Bruno would lie down flat on the ground whenever the child was nearby, so he wouldn't accidentally knock them over." Sarah was falling in love with this gentle giant, but she had practical concerns. "What about exercise needs? Food costs? My house isn't huge." "Actually," Janet said, "that's one of the great things about Mastiffs. They're not high-energy dogs like some breeds. Bruno would be perfectly happy with a couple of walks a day and some playtime in the yard. As for space, he adapts well to different living situations. The food costs are significant because of his size, but he's not a destructive dog, so you wouldn't have to worry about him tearing up furniture or shoes." Bruno seemed to sense they were discussing his future, because he looked up at Sarah with such hope in his eyes that it almost broke her heart. She made a decision that surprised even herself. "I'd like to take him home for a trial period," she said. "If you offer that kind of thing." Janet's face lit up. "We absolutely do. We want to make sure it's a good fit for both of you. We can start with a weekend visit and see how it goes." The paperwork took about an hour, during which Bruno never left Sarah's side. He seemed to understand that something important was happening. When it came time to leave, Bruno walked beside her to the car with perfect manners, but Sarah realized she had a new problem. Her Honda Civic was definitely not built for a 150-pound dog. Bruno solved the problem himself by very carefully climbing into the back seat, then immediately trying to squeeze his massive body into the front seat area so he could be closer to Sarah. She couldn't help but laugh as this enormous dog tried to make himself small enough to fit in spaces clearly designed for much smaller passengers. "Okay, boy," she said, gently guiding him back to the rear seat. "We're going to need to make some adjustments." The drive home was an adventure. Bruno kept trying to put his head on Sarah's shoulder from the back seat, wanting to be close to his new person. Every time she stopped at a red light, other drivers would do double takes at the sight of the massive dog trying to give his new mom affectionate kisses from the back seat. When they arrived at Sarah's house, Bruno stepped out of the car and surveyed his new surroundings with interest. The house had a modest front yard with a picket fence and a larger backyard. Sarah had been worried that he might try to jump the fence or cause problems, but Bruno just walked calmly beside her to the front door, waiting patiently for her to unlock it. The moment they stepped inside, Bruno began what Sarah would later learn was his signature move. Despite being enormous, he started trying to curl up on her small living room couch, convinced that he was the perfect size for a furniture snuggle. Watching a 150-pound dog attempt to make himself comfortable on a couch built for two people was both hilarious and endearing. "Bruno," Sarah laughed, "I don't think you're going to fit there, buddy." But Bruno was determined. He managed to get his front half onto the couch and looked at Sarah as if to say, "See? I told you I'd fit." His back legs were still firmly planted on the floor, and his tail was wagging hopefully. Sarah realized that her quiet, predictable life was about to become much more interesting. As she watched this gentle giant trying to convince her that he was actually a lapdog, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Pure joy. The first night with Bruno was an adventure Sarah hadn't anticipated. She had purchased a large dog bed, thinking it would be perfect for her new companion. Bruno examined the bed carefully, sniffed it thoroughly, and then completely ignored it. Instead, he stood beside Sarah's queen-sized bed, looking at her with those hopeful eyes that had already learned to melt her heart. "Oh no, Bruno," Sarah said gently. "You're way too big to sleep on the bed with me." Bruno tilted his massive head, considering this information. Then, with the determination of a dog who knew what he wanted, he very carefully placed his front paws on the edge of the bed and looked at Sarah questioningly. When she shook her head, he tried a different approach. He lay down on the floor right beside the bed and rested his enormous head on the mattress, as close to Sarah as he could possibly get. "You really don't understand how big you are, do you?" Sarah asked, scratching behind his ears. Bruno's tail thumped against the floor with such enthusiasm that it sounded like someone was drumming. Even lying down, his head reached almost to the middle of the bed. Sarah realized that this was going to be her new normal, a 150-pound shadow who just wanted to be close to his person. Around 3 in the morning, Sarah woke up to find that Bruno had somehow managed to squeeze most of his body onto the foot of her bed. His legs were hanging off the sides, his head was nearly touching her feet, and he was snoring contentedly. The bed was sagging dangerously under his weight, but he looked so peaceful that Sarah didn't have the heart to move him. The next morning brought new challenges. Sarah discovered that Bruno had very specific breakfast expectations. He sat patiently beside his food bowl, but every few seconds he would look toward the kitchen table where Sarah was eating her cereal. His message was clear. He wanted to eat breakfast with his family, not alone by his bowl. "Bruno, you need to eat your breakfast," Sarah encouraged. Bruno approached his bowl, took a few bites, then walked back to Sarah and placed his massive head in her lap while she was trying to eat. Apparently, mealtime was supposed to be a bonding experience, not a solitary activity. Sarah tried to gently guide him back to his food, but Bruno had other ideas. He very carefully maneuvered himself until he was sitting beside her chair, all 150 pounds of him squeezed into a space that was clearly meant for a much smaller companion. His shoulder was pressed against her arm, and he ate his kibble one piece at a time, making sure he could maintain contact with his person throughout the meal. "You really think you're a lapdog, don't you?" Sarah laughed. Bruno's tail wagged in agreement, nearly knocking over a kitchen chair in the process. The real test came when Sarah had to leave for work. She had taken a few days off when she first brought Bruno home, but now she needed to see how he would handle being alone. She prepared for the worst: destroyed furniture, chewed shoes, or anxious behaviors that many dogs exhibited when left alone in a new environment. She set up a camera to monitor him while she was gone, expecting to check in and find chaos. Instead, what she discovered was both heartbreaking and heartwarming. Bruno spent the first hour walking from room to room, clearly looking for Sarah. He would stop at places where she had been: her favorite chair, the spot where she had petted him, even the bathroom where she had gotten ready that morning. After searching the house thoroughly, Bruno made a decision that revealed everything about his personality. He went to Sarah's bedroom, very carefully climbed onto her bed and curled up on her pillow. At 150 pounds, he completely dominated the bed, but he positioned himself so that his head was exactly where Sarah's had been the night before. He stayed there for the entire 8 hours she was at work, moving only to get water or check if she had returned. When Sarah came home that evening, she found Bruno waiting by the front door, his tail wagging so hard his entire body was wiggling. The house was exactly as she had left it. Nothing destroyed, nothing chewed, no accidents. Just a very patient, very large dog who had missed his person desperately. "Were you a good boy today?" Sarah asked, kneeling down to give him attention. Bruno's response was to very gently place his enormous paws on her shoulders and give her face the most careful, gentle kisses she had ever received from a dog. Despite his size, he was incredibly aware of his strength and was always careful not to knock her over or be too rough. That evening, Sarah decided to test Bruno's social skills by taking him for a walk around the neighborhood. She was nervous about how other people would react to such a massive dog. But she quickly discovered that Bruno had an almost magical effect on people. The first person they encountered was Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who was watering her garden. Sarah braced herself for a frightened reaction, but instead Mrs. Chen's face lit up. "Oh my goodness, what a beautiful dog," she exclaimed. "Is he friendly?" Before Sarah could respond, Bruno had approached Mrs. Chen and very gently sat down in front of her, making himself as small and non-threatening as possible. When Mrs. Chen reached out to pet him, Bruno remained perfectly still, allowing her to fuss over him as much as she wanted. "He's so gentle," Mrs. Chen marveled. "You'd never expect such a big dog to be so sweet." This scene repeated itself throughout their walk. Children pointed excitedly at Bruno, and instead of being overwhelmed or overstimulated, he would automatically sit or lie down when they approached, instinctively understanding that he needed to be at their level to avoid being scary. One little girl, maybe 4 years old, asked her mother if she could pet the big doggy. Bruno immediately lay down flat on the sidewalk, making himself as small as possible while still being himself. The little girl giggled and hugged his massive head, and Bruno's tail wagged gently against the concrete. "He's like a teddy bear," the little girl announced. Sarah realized that Bruno wasn't just a dog who thought he was smaller than he was. He was a dog with an incredible emotional intelligence. He seemed to understand exactly how to interact with each person they met, adjusting his behavior to make everyone comfortable. By the time they returned home, Sarah had received 3 requests for Bruno's phone number from neighbors who wanted their dogs to have playdates with him, 2 offers from parents who wanted to hire him as a therapy dog for their children, and 1 marriage proposal from a woman who declared that any man who could handle such a gentle giant must be perfect husband material. "I think you're going to fit in just fine around here," Sarah told Bruno as they settled in for the evening. Bruno's response was to attempt once again to squeeze his 150-pound body into her lap while she sat in her armchair reading. This time Sarah didn't try to discourage him. She simply adjusted her position and let her gentle giant settle in as comfortably as possible, marveling at how such a massive dog could feel so much like a perfect fit. 3 weeks into their life together, Sarah discovered that Bruno had some very specific ideas about personal space, namely, that there should be none between them. Every morning, she would wake up to find 150 pounds of Mastiff somehow balanced precariously on her bed, always positioned as close to her as physically possible without completely crushing her. The situation reached new heights when Sarah caught a cold and decided to spend the day resting on the couch. Bruno took this as a clear invitation to become a living, breathing heating pad. Despite her protest that there wasn't enough room for both of them, Bruno was determined to provide comfort and companionship during her illness. He started by placing just his head on the couch next to her, looking at her with those soulful eyes that seemed to say, "You need me right now." When Sarah didn't object strongly enough, Bruno carefully maneuvered 1 paw onto the couch, then another. Before Sarah knew it, she had a 150-pound Mastiff trying to spoon with her on a couch that was clearly designed for 1 person. "Bruno, sweetie, you're squishing me," Sarah laughed, even as she felt genuinely comforted by his warm presence. Bruno's solution was to readjust his position so that his massive head was resting on her chest. His body stretched across the length of the couch with his legs hanging off the sides. He looked enormously pleased with this arrangement. his tail thumping against the coffee table in satisfaction. Sarah's neighbor, Janet, chose that moment to stop by with some soup for Sarah's cold. When Sarah answered the door, Janet could see Bruno over Sarah's shoulder, still draped across the couch like a furry throw blanket with legs. "Is that your dog, or did someone leave a small horse in your living room?" Janet asked, trying not to laugh. "That's Bruno," Sarah explained. "He's convinced he's a lapdog." "A lapdog?" Janet peered around Sarah to get a better look at Bruno, who had lifted his massive head to see who was visiting. "That's the biggest lapdog I've ever seen." As if he understood the conversation, Bruno very carefully extracted himself from the couch and approached Janet. Instead of jumping up or being overly enthusiastic, he sat down politely and offered her his paw, a gesture so formal and gentlemanly that Janet burst into laughter. "He's like a gentle giant," she marveled, shaking Bruno's enormous paw. "I've never seen a dog that size with such perfect manners." This interaction became a pattern. Bruno seemed to have an innate understanding that his size could be intimidating, so he had developed a repertoire of behaviors designed to put people at ease. When meeting new people, he would automatically sit or lie down. With children, he would flatten himself completely on the ground. With elderly people, he moved in slow motion, as if he understood that sudden movements might startle them. Sarah's friend Mike learned about Bruno's unique personality when he came over to help fix a leaky faucet. Mike was 6 feet tall and weighed about 200 pounds, larger than most people Bruno had met. Sarah was curious to see how Bruno would react to someone who was closer to his own size. The answer was both hilarious and touching. When Mike arrived, Bruno approached him with obvious excitement. Finally, a human who was sort of his size. But instead of his usual gentle approach, Bruno decided that Mike must be big enough to handle a proper dog greeting. Bruno reared up on his hind legs and placed his front paws on Mike's shoulders, bringing them face to face. Mike, who had been expecting a normal-sized dog, suddenly found himself nose to nose with 150 pounds of enthusiastic Mastiff. Sarah?" Mike called, trying to maintain his balance. "Your lapdog is bigger than I am." Bruno, oblivious to Mike's surprise, was delighted to finally meet someone he could greet at eye level. His tail was wagging with such enthusiasm that it was creating a small windstorm in Sarah's living room, knocking over magazines and rattling the windows. "Bruno, down," Sarah commanded, but she was laughing too hard to sound authoritative. Bruno dropped back to all fours but continued to dance around Mike, clearly thrilled to have a playmate who was closer to his size. Mike, once he recovered from the surprise, was completely charmed. "He's like an overgrown puppy," Mike said, as Bruno brought him a tennis ball that looked comically small in his massive jaws. "Does he always act like this?" "Pretty much," Sarah confirmed. "He has no idea how big he is." This became evident when Mike sat down on the floor to pet Bruno. Immediately, Bruno decided that Mike was the perfect size for a proper cuddle session. He very carefully positioned himself so that he was lying across Mike's lap, all 150 pounds of him. Mike looked at Sarah with a mixture of amusement and panic. "I can't feel my legs anymore." "Bruno, you're not a lapdog," Sarah protested, but Bruno just looked at her with confusion. As far as he was concerned, if someone was sitting down and available for cuddling, he was the right size for their lap. The faucet repair took 3 times longer than expected because Bruno was convinced that Mike had come over specifically to provide him with attention and cuddles. Every time Mike tried to work on the plumbing, Bruno would bring him a toy or try to help by resting his massive head on Mike's shoulder. "I've never had a dog supervise my work before," Mike laughed, as Bruno watched him tighten a pipe fitting with intense concentration. When Mike finished the repair, Bruno's farewell was as enthusiastic as his greeting had been. He followed Mike to the door, sat down politely, and offered his paw for a goodbye handshake. When Mike shook his paw, Bruno's entire body wiggled with happiness. "You've got a special dog there," Mike told Sarah as he left. "I've never met an animal with such a big heart to match his big body." That evening, as Sarah reflected on the day, she realized that Mike was right. Bruno wasn't just a big dog who thought he was small. He was a dog with an enormous capacity for love and a desperate desire to share that love with everyone he met. His size made his affectionate gestures more dramatic and sometimes more challenging, but it also made them more memorable and touching. As if reading her thoughts, Bruno approached Sarah as she sat in her armchair, and very gently rested his massive head in her lap. This time, instead of trying to climb up entirely, he seemed content to just be close to her, sharing the quiet evening moment. "You really are perfect just the way you are," Sarah told him, running her fingers through his soft fur. Bruno's tail thumped gently against the floor, and Sarah could swear he smiled. A month into their life together, Sarah decided it was time to introduce Bruno to some new experiences. Their first adventure was a trip to the local pet store, which turned into an unexpectedly entertaining outing for everyone involved. The moment they walked through the automatic doors, Bruno's eyes widened with wonder. He had never seen so many interesting smells, sounds, and sights in one place. However, instead of pulling on his leash or getting overexcited like many dogs, Bruno stopped just inside the entrance and sat down politely, as if asking permission to proceed. "It's okay, boy," Sarah encouraged. "We can look around." Bruno's approach to the pet store was methodical and gentle. He walked slowly down each aisle, stopping to politely sniff items that caught his interest. When they reached the toy section, Bruno's eyes locked onto a display of squeaky toys. He approached a rack of small rubber chickens and very carefully, using just the tip of his massive nose, nudged one gently. The tiny squeak that resulted seemed to delight him enormously. His tail began wagging with such enthusiasm that it knocked several packages of dog treats off a nearby shelf. Bruno immediately looked back at Sarah with an apologetic expression as if to say, "I didn't mean to do that." "Don't worry about it," laughed the store employee who had been watching their progress through the store. "Happens all the time, though usually with much smaller dogs." Bruno's next discovery was the dog bed section. Sarah had been planning to buy him a proper bed since he had been insisting on sharing hers every night. Bruno examined several options with great care, testing each one by gently placing one paw on it, as if checking for comfort and durability. He finally settled on the largest bed in the store, a bed designed for extra-large breeds, that the sales associate assured them would be perfect for Bruno. Bruno seemed pleased with this choice and attempted to demonstrate its comfort by trying to curl up on the display model right there in the store, the sight of a 150-pound Mastiff attempting to make himself comfortable on a dog bed in the middle of the pet store drew quite a crowd. Other shoppers stopped to watch, many of them pulling out their phones to take pictures of the gentle giant, who was completely oblivious to the attention he was attracting. "Excuse me," said a woman with 2 small children. "Would it be okay if my kids met your dog? They've never seen one so big before." Bruno, hearing the children's excited whispers, immediately climbed out of the dog bed and lay down flat on the floor, making himself as non-threatening as possible. The children approached cautiously at first, but Bruno's patient, gentle demeanor quickly won them over. "He's so soft," the younger child exclaimed, running her small hands through Bruno's fur. "Why is he so big?" asked the older child. "He's a Mastiff," Sarah explained. "They're naturally large dogs, but Bruno here thinks he's actually quite small." As if to demonstrate this point, Bruno very carefully rolled onto his side, taking up most of the aisle, and allowed the children to pet his belly. His tail wagged gently, just enough to show his happiness without creating a windstorm that might knock the children over. Other customers began gathering around, drawn by the sight of such a massive yet gentle dog. Bruno handled the attention like a professional, greeting each person politely while remaining calm and controlled. Several people commented that they had never seen such a well-behaved large dog. "He must have had excellent training," observed an elderly gentleman. "Actually," Sarah admitted, "he's just naturally this gentle. He seems to understand that he's big and adjusts his behavior accordingly." Their next stop was the grooming section, where Sarah wanted to buy some brushes and nail clippers appropriate for Bruno's size. The grooming area had a scale for weighing pets, and Sarah was curious to know exactly how much Bruno weighed. Getting Bruno onto the scale proved to be an interesting challenge. The scale was designed to accommodate large dogs, but Bruno seemed confused about why he needed to stand on this strange platform. He approached it cautiously, sniffed it thoroughly, then looked at Sarah for guidance. "Step up, Bruno," she encouraged. Bruno very carefully placed one massive paw on the scale, testing its stability. Satisfied that it wouldn't collapse under his weight, he stepped up completely. The digital display flickered for a moment, then settled on a number that made Sarah's eyes widen. "Can't be 2 pounds," she read aloud. "That's a big boy," commented the store employee. "But he carries it well. Look how nicely he's standing there." Indeed, Bruno was posing on the scale like he was having his portrait taken, standing perfectly still with good posture and a dignified expression. When Sarah told him he could step down, he did so with the same careful precision he had used to get up. Their final stop was the training treat section. Sarah wanted to find some special rewards for Bruno's continued good behavior. Bruno was fascinated by this section, carefully sniffing each type of treat and somehow managing to communicate his preferences without being pushy or demanding. When they reached the checkout counter, Bruno performed his signature move. He sat down beside Sarah and politely offered his paw to the cashier, as if he was helping with the transaction. "He's the most polite customer I've had all day," the cashier laughed, shaking Bruno's enormous paw. The checkout process took a bit longer than usual because other customers kept stopping to ask questions about Bruno. Everyone wanted to know what kind of dog he was, how old he was, and how he had learned to be so well behaved. Bruno accepted all the attention graciously, seeming to understand that he was representing all large dogs and wanting to make a good impression. Loading their purchases into the car presented a new challenge. Sarah had bought Bruno the extra-large dog bed, several toys, grooming supplies, and a month's worth of food. The back of her Honda Civic was completely packed, leaving no room for Bruno. Bruno surveyed the situation and came up with his own solution. He very carefully climbed into the front passenger seat, adjusted his position so that his head wasn't hitting the roof, and looked at Sarah expectantly. The sight of her massive dog sitting in the passenger seat like a human companion was so ridiculous that Sarah couldn't stop laughing. "Okay, Bruno, but you're going to have to navigate," she told him as they drove home. Bruno took this responsibility seriously, watching the road intently and occasionally looking over at Sarah, as if checking that she was paying proper attention to her driving. Several times during the trip, other drivers pulled up beside them at red lights just to get a better look at the enormous dog riding shotgun. When they arrived home, Bruno was eager to try out his new bed. Sarah set it up in the living room and Bruno approached it with great ceremony. He walked around it several times, sniffed it thoroughly, then very carefully settled down onto it. For about 30 seconds, Bruno looked perfectly content with his appropriately sized bed. Then he looked over at Sarah, who was sitting on the couch, and his expression became wistful. The new bed was nice, but it was all the way across the room from his favorite person. Bruno stood up, picked up his new bed in his massive jaws, and carried it over to the couch. He positioned it right beside where Sarah was sitting, then settled down onto it with a satisfied sigh. "There we go," Sarah said, reaching down to pet him. "Now you have the best of both worlds, your own bed and cuddles with me." Bruno's tail thumped against his new bed in perfect contentment. He had found the ideal solution, a proper place to sleep that still allowed him to be as close as possible to his beloved human. 2 months into their relationship, Sarah faced her biggest challenge yet, introducing Bruno to her extended family during their annual summer barbecue. She was nervous about how her relatives would react to her massive new companion, especially since several family members had small children and weren't particularly comfortable around large dogs. The morning of the barbecue, Sarah gave Bruno an extra thorough brushing and a pep talk. "Okay, big guy, you're going to meet a lot of new people today. I need you to be on your best behavior." Bruno seemed to sense the importance of the occasion. As Sarah gathered supplies for the barbecue, he followed her around the house with unusual seriousness, as if he was preparing for an important job interview. When they arrived at her sister Linda's house, Bruno immediately assessed the situation. There were cars in the driveway, sounds of conversation and laughter coming from the backyard, and the exciting smells of grilled food in the air. Instead of getting overexcited, Bruno sat down beside the car and looked at Sarah, waiting for guidance on how to proceed. "Good boy," Sarah praised, clipping on his leash. "Remember, gentle and polite." Their entrance into the backyard caused quite a stir. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as 20-plus family members turned to stare at the enormous dog walking calmly beside Sarah. Bruno, sensing he was the center of attention, did what he always did in these situations. He immediately sat down and made himself as small and non-threatening as possible. Sarah's nephew, Tommy, age 5, was the first to break the silence. "Aunt Sarah, is that a horse?" This broke the tension and everyone began laughing. Bruno's tail began wagging cautiously, as if he wasn't sure whether the laughter was a good sign or not. "Everyone, this is Bruno," Sarah announced. "He's very gentle, but I understand if anyone is uncomfortable around large dogs." Sarah's mother, who had been vocal about her concerns regarding Bruno's size, approached first. At 72, she moved slowly and used a walking cane. Bruno seemed to recognize that this human needed special consideration. He lay down flat on the grass and very carefully inched forward on his belly until he was close enough for her to pet him without having to bend over. "Well, aren't you a thoughtful boy?" Sarah's mother said, reaching down to pat Bruno's massive head. "You're much more considerate than most of the men in this family." This earned another round of laughter and helped break the ice. One by one, family members approached Bruno, and he greeted each person with perfect courtesy. With the men, he stood and offered his paw for handshakes. With the women, he sat politely and allowed them to pet him. With the children, he automatically lay down completely flat, making himself as approachable as possible. Sarah's brother-in-law, Dave, who considered himself something of a dog expert, was initially skeptical. "Dogs this size can be unpredictable," he muttered to his wife. "One snap and someone could get seriously hurt." Bruno seemed to hear this comment because he approached Dave very slowly and deliberately. Instead of his usual friendly greeting, Bruno sat down about 3 feet away from Dave and simply waited, making no moves that could be interpreted as threatening. His posture was relaxed but respectful, and his expression was patient and kind. Dave stared at Bruno for a long moment, then slowly extended his hand for Bruno to sniff. Bruno very gently sniffed Dave's hand, then carefully moved closer and rested his massive head against Dave's knee, not pushing or demanding attention, just making contact. "Okay," Dave admitted, beginning to pet Bruno's soft fur. "Maybe I was wrong about big dogs." The real test came when it was time to eat. Sarah had been worried about how Bruno would behave around food with so many people around. She needn't have worried. Bruno positioned himself under a shady tree where he could see everyone, but wasn't in the way of foot traffic. He lay down calmly and watched the family activities with interest, but without begging or trying to get food from anyone. When Sarah's young cousin spilled some hamburger near Bruno, everyone held their breath. Bruno looked at the dropped food, then up at the child, then over at Sarah. Instead of eating the food, he very gently nudged it closer to the child with his nose, as if helping to clean up the mess. "Did he just help pick up the food instead of eating it?" asked Linda in amazement. "That's just Bruno," Sarah said proudly. "He's always helpful." As the afternoon progressed, Bruno won over every single family member. He played gentle fetch with the children, using a tennis ball that looked comically small in his massive jaws. He sat patiently while Sarah's elderly aunt told him long stories about her own dogs from years past. He even allowed himself to be used as a pillow by Tommy, who declared that Bruno was the best dog couch ever. The breakthrough moment came when Sarah's cousin brought her 6-month-old baby, Emma, outside for the first time that day. Sarah's cousin, Jessica, had been hesitant about bringing the baby around such a large dog, but curiosity had won out. Bruno's reaction to seeing the baby was remarkable. His entire demeanor changed instantly. He became even more careful and deliberate in his movements, as if he understood that this tiny human required extra special consideration. When Jessica sat down in a lawn chair with Emma on her lap, Bruno approached very slowly and lay down flat on the ground about 6 feet away. "He knows she's just a baby," Jessica marveled, watching Bruno's incredibly gentle behavior. Bruno remained in that position for several minutes, just watching the baby with fascination and respect. When Emma began fussing, Bruno's ears perked up with concern, but he didn't move from his spot. Instead, he made a soft, low sound, almost like a gentle rumble, that seemed to catch the baby's attention. Emma stopped fussing and looked around until she spotted Bruno. Instead of being frightened by his size, she seemed mesmerized by this enormous, gentle creature. When she started to fuss again a few minutes later, Bruno repeated his soft rumbling sound. And again, Emma calmed down. "I think he's trying to help soothe her," Jessica observed with wonder. When it came time for family photos, Bruno naturally became the star attraction. Every family group wanted pictures with the gentle giant. Bruno seemed to understand the importance of staying still for photos, posing patiently while children climbed around. Him and adults arranged themselves for the perfect shot. The most memorable photo of the day showed Bruno lying flat on the grass with all 6 of Sarah's nieces and nephews arranged around him like he was a furry playground. Bruno's expression in the photo was one of pure contentment. This was exactly what he had always wanted, to be surrounded by his pack and covered in love and attention. As the sun began to set and the barbecue wound down, family members started saying their goodbyes. Each person made sure to give Bruno a special farewell, and many of them asked Sarah for his contact information so they could arrange visits. "You know," Sarah's father said quietly as he was leaving, "I was worried when you told us about adopting such a large dog. I thought maybe you were taking on more than you could handle. But watching him today, I think he was exactly what our family needed." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "Look around." Her father gestured toward the yard where Bruno was receiving final pets and hugs from the children. "When's the last time you saw this family so united about anything? That dog brought out the best in all of us today." Sarah realized her father was right. There had been no family drama, no arguments, no tension between the adults. Everyone had been focused on Bruno and the joy he brought to the gathering. He had somehow managed to be a calming, unifying presence that brought out everyone's gentler nature. The drive home was peaceful, with Bruno stretched across the back seat, exhausted but happy from his day of socializing. Every few minutes he would lift his massive head to look at Sarah, as if checking to make sure she was as content as he was. "You were absolutely perfect today," Sarah told him as they pulled into their driveway. "I'm so proud of you." Bruno's tail managed a few tired wags, and when they got inside the house, he went straight to his bed and collapsed with a satisfied sigh. But even in his exhaustion, when Sarah sat down on the couch, Bruno lifted his head hopefully. "Come on then," Sarah laughed. Patting the couch beside her, Bruno carefully climbed up onto the couch, somehow managing to arrange his 150-pound body so that he could cuddle with Sarah without completely crushing her. As they settled in together, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed since that day at the animal shelter. She had thought she was just adopting a dog, but Bruno had brought so much more into her life. He had introduced her to neighbors she had never met, strengthened her relationships with family and friends, and taught her that sometimes the best things come in unexpectedly large packages. Bruno's gentle snoring filled the quiet house, and Sarah felt a deep sense of gratitude for this gentle giant who had chosen her to be his person. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new people to meet, and new opportunities for Bruno to share his enormous heart with the world. 6 months after adopting Bruno, Sarah's life had settled into a wonderful routine filled with gentle chaos and unexpected joy. Bruno had not only established himself as the neighborhood's beloved gentle giant, but he had also developed some endearing quirks that made their daily life together an adventure. One crisp autumn morning, Sarah discovered Bruno's latest attempt at being helpful. She'd been running late for work and rushing around the house gathering her things when she noticed Bruno following her with unusual purpose. Every time she set something down, her keys, her coffee mug, her laptop bag, Bruno would very carefully pick it up in his massive jaws and bring it to the front door. "Bruno, what are you doing?" Sarah asked, watching him gently carry her travel mug to his growing collection by the door. Bruno looked at her with obvious pride, his tail wagging as he surveyed his work. He had created a neat pile of all her morning essentials, apparently deciding that if she was rushing around so much, she must need help organizing her departure. "You're trying to help me get ready for work, aren't you?" Sarah realized. Bruno's entire body wiggled with happiness at being understood. From that morning forward, he appointed himself as Sarah's personal assistant, carefully gathering her belongings each morning and arranging them by the door. The only problem was that Bruno couldn't distinguish between things Sarah needed for work and things she didn't. So she often found her slippers, a book she'd been reading, and sometimes even his own toys added to the pile. This helpful behavior extended to other areas of their life together. When the mailman arrived each day, Bruno had developed a ritual of greeting him at the fence and then carefully carrying the mail to the front door. The mailman, initially nervous about the massive dog, had become completely charmed by Bruno's gentle assistance. "He's better than most mail sorters I've worked with," the mailman told Sarah one day. "Never loses a letter, never damages anything. Just takes it straight to your door and sets it down carefully." Bruno's reputation in the neighborhood had grown to legendary status. Parents would bring their children by specifically to meet him, knowing that Bruno would provide a perfect introduction to how wonderful dogs could be. The local elementary school even invited Bruno to visit during their Community Helpers Week, where he demonstrated how therapy dogs assist people. The school visit was magical. Bruno seemed to understand the importance of the occasion and was on his absolute best behavior. He allowed dozens of small hands to pet him, sat perfectly still for story time, and even participated in a gentle game of fetch using a tennis ball that looked absurdly small in his massive jaws. One little girl who had been afraid of dogs before meeting, Bruno wrote him a thank you letter afterward. "Dear Bruno," it read in careful second-grade handwriting, "thank you for showing me that big dogs can be nice. You are very soft and you don't scare me anymore. Love, Lily." Sarah kept that letter on her refrigerator, but she wasn't the only one who treasured it. Bruno seemed to sense its importance and would often sit in front of the refrigerator, looking up at the letter with what could only be described as pride. As winter approached, Bruno faced his first real challenge in his new life. Sarah had to travel for work, a 3-day conference that she couldn't avoid. She had arranged for her neighbor Janet to check on Bruno and walk him, but she was worried about how he would handle being separated from her for so long. The night before her departure, Bruno seemed to sense something was different. He followed Sarah even more closely than usual, pressing against her legs as she packed her suitcase. When she tried to go to bed, Bruno positioned himself so that he was touching her in some way, his head on her feet, his back pressed against the side of the bed, maintaining physical contact throughout the night. "I'll be back in 3 days," Sarah promised him the next morning. "Janet will take good care of you." Bruno watched from the front window as Sarah's taxi pulled away, his massive head pressed against the glass. Janet later told Sarah that Bruno had maintained that vigil for almost an hour after the taxi disappeared, waiting to see if Sarah might come back. For the first day, Bruno was subdued but well-behaved. He ate his meals, went for his walks with Janet, and followed his normal routine. But by the second day, his heartbreak was evident. Janet found him lying on Sarah's bed, his head buried in her pillow, hardly moving except to go outside when necessary. "He's not sick," Janet assured Sarah during their phone call. "He's just missing you terribly. I've never seen a dog so devoted to one person." On the third day, something remarkable happened. Janet arrived for Bruno's morning walk to find him waiting by the front door with his leash in his mouth and Sarah's favorite sweater carefully arranged at his feet. He had somehow managed to get the sweater from her closet and brought it downstairs, creating a small shrine to his missing person. "I think he's planning something," Janet told Sarah. "He keeps looking at the door like he's expecting you to walk through it at any moment." Janet was right. When Sarah's taxi pulled into the driveway that evening, Bruno was already at the front door, somehow having sensed her return before the car was even visible. The moment Sarah stepped out of the taxi, she could hear Bruno's excited whining and the sound of his tail banging against the door. When she finally opened the front door, Bruno's greeting was unlike anything she had ever experienced. All 150 pounds of him launched into her arms, nearly knocking her over with the enthusiasm of his reunion. He covered her face with gentle kisses, pressed his massive body against her, and made soft whimpering sounds of pure joy. "I missed you too, baby," Sarah laughed, trying to maintain her balance under the assault of Bruno's affection. For the rest of the evening, Bruno refused to leave Sarah's side. He followed her from room to room, maintaining physical contact whenever possible. When she sat down to eat dinner, Bruno positioned himself so that he was leaning against her chair. When she went to unpack, he lay down directly on top of her suitcase, as if preventing her from ever packing again. That night, Bruno abandoned all pretense of sleeping in his own bed. He climbed onto Sarah's bed and arranged himself so that his entire 150-pound body was pressed against her, as if making sure she couldn't disappear again without him knowing about it. Okay, Sarah laughed, adjusting her position to accommodate her enormous bedmate. "I get the message. No more business trips without you." As if he understood her promise, Bruno finally relaxed, letting out a contented sigh that seemed to come from the depths of his massive chest. His gentle snoring soon filled the room, and Sarah found herself marveling at how this gentle giant had so completely captured her heart. A year ago, she had been living a quiet, predictable life. Now she couldn't imagine existing without Bruno's constant companionship, his gentle humor, and his enormous capacity for love. He had taught her that sometimes the best things in life come in the biggest packages, and that true devotion doesn't depend on size. It depends on the size of the heart. As Sarah drifted off to sleep with her 150-pound lapdog taking up most of her bed, she smiled at the thought that tomorrow would bring new adventures with her gentle giant, who would undoubtedly continue to approach the world with the unshakable belief that he was exactly the right size for any lap that needed filling.